Well, hello, everyone. I'm Sarah Halter. I'm the executive director of the Indiana Medical History Museum, and I'm delighted to be here today for the spring 2025 installment of the Forensic Science Lecture Series. This has been one of my favorite lecture series since I started working at the Indiana Medical History Museum way back in this February of 2007, I think. So it's the series has existed longer than that. Um, I also want to thank everyone for their patience today as we sort of went back and forth about whether to have the event in person. It was a tough decision, but many of you who've been to the museum know that there is not a single room in that building that doesn't have large windows, and we don't really have a safe place for 100 people to gather and shelter in case of emergency. So since the risk seemed at the time and still seems to be very real, we decided to just move it to all virtual. So thank you for sticking with us. So tonight's speaker is Hamilton County Coroner Jeff Jellison. We are very grateful to him for making time in his very busy schedule to come and speak with us today. This is a very timely topic, and there's a lot of excitement about this program. So we're happy to have him here. We appreciate his efforts, and I will turn things over to him, and he has way more interesting things to say, I'm sure.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it. And, I would just like to thank Sarah for her concern today for everyone's safety with the storms coming through Indiana like they are. And I would also like to for your patience and your flexibility in doing this event tonight virtually rather than in person. And certainly we all would have preferred to gather together tonight to discuss the Fox Hollow case. But unfortunately, just with the weather conditions, I really support Sarah's decision to keep everyone safe. I'd like to thank Sarah for inviting me to participate tonight. I hope that I'm able to give an informative presentation and certainly open to any of your questions. In addition to Sarah, I would like to thank Dr. Latham from University of Indianapolis for joining us tonight. In the audience is also Laura Musil, J.J. Beck. Laura is a newspaper reporter from the middle 90s that extensively covered this event. She's a fantastic historian to the case. J.J. Beck is in attendance tonight. J.J. supports the Hamilton County Coroner's Office from a forensic genetic genealogy standpoint. Really happy to have her support in this case. And then also tonight joining us are members of the Allen Livingston family. Allen Livingston, as you know, was one of the first folks that we identified once we renewed this investigation. Very much like to thank them for being here tonight. This investigation would not have been possible without the help of the University of Indianapolis, the Indiana State Police, and the FBI, and some other partners that we have out there supporting it to this date. We also look forward to some new team members joining the investigation, and we'll be announcing those shortly. So we're excited about the direction that this investigation is taking. Fox Hollow, in the early to middle 90s, there were several men reported missing from Indianapolis, which eventually led to an investigation conducted by the Indianapolis Police Department. There was also a private detective that was involved in the case and very instrumental in getting the case off of the ground. These men were missing, and it was later suspected that Herb Baumeister was associated to all of these missing people. And eventually a search warrant was served on Fox Hollow Farm. which is located in Westfield, just about a mile and a half west of US 31 on 156th Street. When law enforcement served that search warrant, they recovered nearly 10,000 bone and bone fragments. And from what I'm told today, this is the second largest investigation of unidentified human remains in this country. And certainly back then, it was the first largest. It is second today only to the World Trade Center. So as you can suspect, we have a huge job in front of us in efforts to identify the remains and some of these missing people. You many times throughout this investigation, I've been asked about, are these individuals, were all these individuals gay? Were they all men? And, we don't know the answer to that. We're working hard, to identify those. And, but we do believe that Herb Baumeister did prey upon gay men from Indianapolis. So during the excavation, the initial excavation, when police were recovering remains, Herb Baumeister went missing. He went to his family's own lake house in northern Indiana. Police located him there. They realized that he had his son with him. So there was some to get some court orders to get the son, and law enforcement was able to retrieve him and get him back to a safe spot. After the son was retrieved, Baumeister made a trip to Canada, and where he eventually killed himself as a result of a gunshot. When Baumeister was in Canada, he was stopped by the Canadian police, and one of the police officers noted that he had a box of videotapes in the back seat of his car. Those videotapes were never recovered. And, those videotapes are important for the reason that they believe Baumeister may have videoed some of the killings of these individuals. So those have not been found yet, and they were not found at the scene when Herb was found dead. So today, where we're at with this investigation, or a little bit of leading up to today, in 2022, I was contacted by Eric Pranger. Eric identified himself as Alan Livingston's cousin, and Eric indicated to me that Alan went missing in the early 90s, and asked me to help provide Alan's mother with some closure. Eric indicated that she was ill and was not expected to survive. So, I mean, how do you say no to someone asking for that type of help? Leading up to that, in the 80s and early 90s, I was a police officer in Carmel, Indiana, and I knew about Fox Hollow, but I'd already left law enforcement by the time the search warrant was served. I lived about a mile and a half from Fox Hollow Farm at the time the police recovered the remains. So I knew a little bit about it, but not in any detail. I was completely unaware that law enforcement or previous coroners had not made any efforts for roughly 26 years to further the investigation or identify the remains. So when Eric called me, I agreed to help. Had no idea what I was getting into at that point. My first thought was, where are these remains? Because I knew that they were not in our office. So I called a previous coroner, inquired about that. He informed me that the remains were being housed at the University of Indianapolis, who assisted law enforcement with the investigation in the 90s. So I called the University of Indianapolis and spoke with Dr. Latham, and I asked her what we had there. And surprisingly, Dr. Latham informed me that we had 10,000 bone and bone fragments. I don't know if it was a defense mechanism for me or what, but I thought she said 1,000, and she very quickly corrected me and did say 10,000 bone and bone fragments. Uh, at that point, I can remember sitting back going, what do we do? With 10,000 remains. Um, it was, it was really shocking to have heard that. And to find out that there had been nothing done with those remains from the perspective of a coroner or from law enforcement to identify them. So, I knew at that point that really I was way in over my head with this investigation. It was not something I was going to be able to handle myself. But I did, I knew enough that I knew I needed to reach out to the public and ask family members that have missing people to come forward and provide us with a family reference sample, a DNA swab. So I went on social media and then also contacted the local Indianapolis TV stations, their news departments, and they were very gracious about getting my plea out. And immediately we had a number of people come forward and provide us with these family reference samples. So what do we do from there? We've got some family members in one hand, we have 10,000 bones and bone fragments at the University of Indianapolis. How do we bring this together? And, I was fortunate enough then the next day to get a phone call from the Indiana State Police, and they offered the assistance of their DNA services. And what they suggested to me at that time was that we continue to attempt to get family reference samples from people that had missing persons in their family. Uh, and we would work together with Dr. Latham in selecting remains that would be delivered to the Indiana State Police for the DNA work. The DNA profiles from the family reference samples would be entered into CODIS, the National Missing Person Database, and the DNA samples or the DNA results from the remains would also be entered into CODIS, hoping to get a match. At that time, and still today, we're only sending about 20 remains a quarter to the Indiana State Police. So you could tell from just sheer numbers that this investigation is a long haul investigation. Some of the remains may not produce DNA profiles, but we all agree that it is important that we continue to preserve those remains with DNA technology improving and advancing, at a very rapid rate. What we may not be able to do today, we hopefully will be able to do tomorrow. The first batch of remains went to the Indiana State Police, and they began their work on them. Shortly after that, I was at a ribbon cutting for a mental health program, and my cell phone had rang. It was the Indiana State Police, and they said that they had a match. And I told them I was at a ribbon cutting. I would call them just as soon as I got back to my office and talk to them in more details about it. So just as soon as I was able to get back to the office, I called. I asked them who that first match was, and they informed me it was Alan Livingston. And, at first I didn't believe them because, again, it was Alan's family that made the plea to reopen the investigation. And with him being the first person identified, that was amazing. It was, it was a God thing. And I think it also spoke to the team working on this case that we're doing the right thing. The time that we are spending on this case is the right thing to do. And along with spending tax dollars on this case. We knew it would be an expensive investigation, so in cooperation with the Indianapolis Police Department, we were able to get a federal grant to reimburse Hamilton County for DNA work done in private laboratories. We knew at some point that we would end up in private laboratories, to do further DNA testing and also to go with the forensic genetic genealogy. So during this time, we've identified many remains of 8 individuals that were originally identified in the initial investigation in the 90s, and then additional remains of Alan Livingston. And right now we have several DNA profiles that are unmatched to family reference samples that are going to Othram Laboratory and to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification for additional work. So we're excited that we're seeing results. It's this is an investigation that requires patience. Sometimes patience is not my strongest point, but I do appreciate everyone that is involved in the investigation. We have some of the best people in the country working this case. Throughout this investigation, I had an opportunity to meet with and become close with many of these family members. And what I really found interesting was their appreciation after 30 years now of reopening this case. They didn't write their loved ones off as, oh, well, they'll never know. They, during this whole time, wanted to know. They wanted to know back in the 90s what had happened to their loved one. And I heard the frustration from them. Very early on in the investigation, I had learned that we had some remains that had been identified in the 90s of an individual that had not been returned to the family members. I was able to track down this person. The victim was Michael Keir. I was able to track down Michael's sister and informed her that we had the remains and we would like to return them to her. And initially, she was resistant to that. And during conversation, I understand her reasons, but a primary reason was the way that these families have been treated and the lack of compassion that was shown to these families by law enforcement during the initial investigation. Many families have told me stories of being called into the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department and told that their loved ones' remains would be returned to them. And when they got there, it was a raw bone in a paper grocery sack that was presented to them. And that's you can imagine just how horrible that was. But you can also imagine the foundation that was set at that point for the lack of compassion that was shown to these families. So after I got involved, I said, we have to do this differently. We have to find better ways to return these remains to the family. So going back to the sister, initially she was resistant to the remains being returned, and I understood. So I said, okay, we're going to do this a little different. I contacted a local funeral home and asked that they cremate the remains and also to donate a beautiful urn that they donated for those remains to be placed in. Then we also learned that there was a cemetery, a kind of a family cemetery in the area where the sister lived, and those people offered their service in opening a grave and in case the family wanted to bury those remains. So I called the sister back and explained to her how we were doing it differently at this time. and she agreed to accept the remains. And we were very glad, very happy to have kind of changed the perception of coroners and law enforcement from the initial investigation. So that was in November. And in December of that year, I got a Christmas card, and it was from the sister. And the Christmas card simply said, Jeff, thank you for the closure I didn't know I needed. And I think that that really, really speaks um, for where these family members, were coming from, and being able to provide them with closure in this investigation. There's two really primary goals I have in identifying these remains. One is these remains represent people, and these people are sitting on a shelf, and we need to get them off of a shelf to a final resting place. The other priority I had is to provide the families with some answers and some closure. And I do believe that this investigation is working in both of those directions. So as we kind of walked through this investigation, we knew at some point that we would have remains identified that maybe family members did not want returned. So what do we do with those remains? I'm not going to allow them to continue to sit on a shelf. So we were contacted by an organization. Their name is He Knows Your Name. And they offered to build a memorial and an ossuary at a cemetery in Westfield. And the interesting part of that is obviously Fox Hollow Farm being in Westfield. So Linda Zanacco and the good people of He Knows Your Name built this beautiful memorial, and there's an ossuary there where once these remains are identified, if the family does not want them returned, then we have a place to put that person as a final resting spot. Or if a family chooses to have their loved ones' remains go to that memorial, it's a beautiful memorial. It has, all of the identified people's names on a plaque or on plaques next to the memorial. So it was a fantastic solution to what do we do with these remains. I'm very critical of law enforcement of the 90s and their investigation. It just really kind of sets wrong with me that the prosecutor felt like that she didn't have enough evidence to issue an arrest warrant. And, I understand that from my law enforcement days. But they're digging up human remains in Herb Baumeister's backyard. And they allowed Baumeister to travel all over the state and eventually to Canada where he killed himself. Now, Laura Musil said in the documentary, she put it as good as it could have been said, that if law enforcement, if she had human bones in her backyard, she's pretty sure law enforcement wouldn't let her just go where she wanted to. And, so I think the real disappointing thing here is the fact that they were never able to arrest Herb Baumeister. Mark Goodyear, who is an interesting individual, who initially told police that he was a survivor of Baumeister, who then recanted his story and said he was a friend of Baumeister, even admitted to a 2-year relationship with Baumeister. Mark Goodyear said in the documentary that Herb Baumeister told him that he killed 56 people. If that in fact is true, he's probably the most prolific serial killer in this country. And it wasn't, the investigation didn't take it in that direction. They identified initially 8 men. and the suspect, their suspect, or the only suspect that they thought that they had at that time, is dead. So it was almost like it's game over. 8 gay men from Indianapolis, recovered in conservative Hamilton County, game over. And that's a hard pill for me to swallow. Uh, it's Baumeister didn't get a lot of attention in the media when this event happened. And I believe the reason for that was because law enforcement was never able to walk a bad guy into the courtroom. Baumeister was every bit as prolific as Gacy or Dahmer, but those guys got the attention from the media, or the case got the attention from the media, because they were able to make an arrest and walk people into a courtroom. So for 26, 27 years, this case just kind of sat forgotten in the background. And I really credit the Livingston family and Eric Pranger, for making that phone call and bringing this to my attention. So, I mean, would those remains have sat there for eternity? At what point would someone have done something? And the more generations of coroners and the more generation of law enforcement, the more that this case would have been forgotten. So, when you look at this case, I am critical of law enforcement and the direction that the investigation, you know, but it was in the 90s. Law enforcement didn't have the staff, the manpower that they have today. Maybe they did the best job that they could with the technology and talents they had at that time. So, very recently, there was a documentary released about Fox Hollow Farm. I participated in the documentary. Some key people in that documentary again was Laura Musil, and Steve Ainsworth, who is a cold case detective from Colorado. He's had a very successful career as a detective in his state. Other key people in the documentary was the property owner, Rob Graves, and then certainly a key individual was Mark Goodyear. Again, Mark Goodyear was the person that really led police to Herb Baumeister. He told police a story about how he went to Baumeister's home, and that he was a victim of Baumeister there, and he survived that, and that he did that to help police get their search warrant. And then as you watch the documentary, you'll learn that Mark Goodyear wasn't that victim, that survivor. He admits that he had that relationship with Herb Baumeister. He certainly knows a lot about the case. He, in one hand, described Baumeister as a monster, and in the next breath, he talks about how Baumeister came to his house for dinner. I don't know about you, but me, if I think somebody's a monster and I know that that person is a serial killer, I don't think I'd be inviting them over to my house to grill burgers on the grill. So Mark Goodyear's a very interesting individual, and certainly has a lot of knowledge about this case uh, as a result of his relationship with Baumeister. Rob Graves is the current property owner of Fox Hollow Farm, and Rob lives in a home that was a former home of a serial killer. Rob is an absolute historian on this case as well. He owns a piece of property where 10,000 human remains and bone fragments were recovered. I think Rob along with myself and a few other individuals, believe that there are still remains on that property, and we will make every effort in the future to recover those remains if possible. So that's where we are today. Um, Again, this investigation will far exceed my term limits as coroner. I hope the next coroner carries the torch and continues the investigation. So what I'd like to do now is just kind of open it up to everyone for questions. We have Dr. Latham here to support us from the scientific end. I'm certainly able to answer more detailed questions about the investigation. And if need be, we can bring some of the people from the audience in that might have some knowledge about the case. So again, thank you for being here today. Thank you for allowing me to talk about this case.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. We do have some questions that have come in online. I guess I can just start at the top and go down. Corinne, well, she first says thanks. Corinne asks, has law enforcement looked into whether Mr. Goodyear visited Canada around the time of Herb's death?
So I assume that question probably stems from the documentary, because at one point in the documentary, there was some mention about Goodyear being unaccounted for at one point. You know, I have not seen any information that would indicate law enforcement checked with authorities at the border to see if Goodyear crossed into Canada. So I don't know the answer to that. And keep in mind that some of the investigation on the criminal side that I talk about, my knowledge is limited to information that law enforcement has provided me with. My job is identification, cause, and manner of death. But I have not seen anything in reviewing the case report that indicates law enforcement made any contact with Canadian authorities about Mark Goodyear.
Thank you. Andrea just wants to say that they're from Carmel. They grew up there when it was happening, former friends of Herb's nephew, and wanted to say thank you for reopening the case.
Thank you. I appreciate your comment.
Abby asks, what, if anything, can civilians do to help? And is Mark Goodyear under surveillance or on any watch list?
So I'll address the first part of that question. You know, since that documentary come out, I have been contacted by a large number of people that have offered their support through words. They've offered their support with their time, and they've offered even financial assistance to make sure that the investigation continues. And I very much appreciate each one of those. Uh, if we get to that point, that we would need actual hands-on assistance from the public, or if we would need some type of financial support, I'll reach out through social media and reach out through television news and ask for that. But you don't know how much that means to me to for people to step up and offer their help.
Kelly asks, why was he not arrested when his son was taken? I don't know that you can answer that, but if you want to take a stab at it.
You know, I can't answer that, but you know, again, what did police have at that time? And that time was when they were excavating human remains. Um, just because there's human remains found on someone's property doesn't necessarily mean that a crime has been committed. You know, there are other reasons for human remains to be on that property. You know, whether they were ancient remains or, you know, a burial site, something like that. And I just don't know. I mean, certainly law enforcement has some supporting evidence, um, through Mark Goodyear and their investigation about what happened on that property. Um, and you know, it's a travesty that Baumeister wasn't arrested. If they just didn't have enough to convince a judge for a search warrant, I don't know. Um, was, there was no surveillance on Herb Baumeister after his son was retrieved. So just how serious were they looking at him as a suspect at that time? Again, to Laura's statement on the documentary, they're digging up human bones in someone's backyard and they let him travel freely. I I, I don't understand that.
Um, this is more a question about sort of the bones themselves. Corinne asks, can you tell which bones belong together visually, or is it via DNA testing?
So I think that's a great question for Dr. Latham.
Unmute myself there. No, I think that's one of the challenges that we face here with many cases that we work. It's a single death or a few death scene, and you can take one bone from that individual, do DNA testing, and be confident that everything else belongs to that individual and return all of those remains back to the family. In this case, there was extensive commingling and damage of the remains. They're fragmented, they're burned. So we are not making any assumptions that anything goes together. We want to make sure that we are using DNA profiling in order to reassociate individuals, and then be able to provide as much of that individual back to their family as possible.
Thank you. Kind of along those lines, Kelsey asks, is it possible that more remains could have been washed down into the creek and gone to larger bodies of water where we would be unable to find them?
Again, I think Dr. Latham is probably the expert on recovering human remains like that, so I'll default to her.
Well, I can say that I wasn't there in the 90s as part of the initial recovery to see exactly where everything was at. But just based on the sheer number of remains, is it possible that there are still some left on the property? Absolutely. And like Coroner Jellison already mentioned, there's some plans in place to further investigate that to see if anything else can be located, recovered from the property. But I can't speak specifically to where things may or may not be because I wasn't there at the time.
Jamie says, thank you so much for helping the families have closure.
Thank you, Jamie.
Abby asks, and this probably isn't a question you can answer either, but can the families come together and file a civil suit against Hamilton County for the lack of investigation and identification initially?
You know what I hear right there is frustration. People are frustrated. They lost loved ones. They're grieving. And I get it. I've talked to many of you, and I absolutely understand where you're coming from. So as I can speak from the team, and that team is University of Indianapolis, the Indiana State Police, the FBI, local law enforcement that is involved there, today's local law enforcement, and all of our other partners, is our hearts are with you. We're sorry that the investigation stopped when it stopped and lack of answers were provided.
Michael asks, how many additional profiles of people have been identified so far? Even if, I assume he means even if you don't know specifically who they are.
Dr. Latham, please correct me if I'm wrong. 4? Am I correct on 4?
We currently have 3 additional DNA profiles that we cannot associate with family reference samples.
You know, an interesting part of this too was um, during this investigation, I had a lady contact me, said she had a missing person in her family. And I asked her to provide a family reference sample, a DNA swab. That was entered in the CODIS, and we received a match on some remains that were recovered in Las Vegas. And I think that you know we we didn't expect that type of thing to happen, but it didn't surprise us. And you know, so this investigation may very well be a vehicle to provide closure to family members that are unrelated to Baumeister.
An attendee asks a question that I was wondering too when I watched the documentary. Do you know what mental hospital her Baumeister's father had him committed to shortly after he and Julie were married?
I do not. I'm sorry, I do not.
Um, Bob asks, was the resistance of law enforcement due to the victims being gay?
You know that's a fantastic question. One, we don't know that all these people were gay, you know, because we've not identified everyone. We don't even know that all of these people were male. So, you know, again, we just don't know that. But, you know, with what we do know, that, you know, if this investigation would have involved the identification of 8 teenage girls from Carmel, something like that, Westfield, would we have given up? You know, I've always asked myself that. Would we have stopped? Or would we still be out there today trying to recover remains? And would there have been a 27-year gap in no effort being placed in this investigation? That's a question that's commonly asked, and just simply that's my thoughts on it. I think that, you know, it was 8 gay men from Indianapolis, suspects dead, game over.
Um, Shannon asks a question I think that is a good follow-up to what you just said. What is a question about the case or your work on the case that you wished you were asked more?
Yeah, you know, is my loved one a part of them? You know, I mean, because I need you. I need you to ask that question because I need family members to come forward. You know, I think Dr. Latham and certainly the great people at the Indiana State Police will tell you the most efficient way to identify these remains is through family reference samples. Um, so I would love to have more people knocking on my door asking to provide, you know, a DNA sample and wanting to know if their loved one was a part of this.
We have a question about investigative genetic genealogy as well. What role, if any, has that played in the case, or has it entirely rested upon family members of missing men providing samples?
So investigating genetic genealogy is huge to this case. And, you know, I think that that's where we will see a lot of our identifications come from. Um, we currently have an individual that was identified by genealogy investigators at Othram Laboratories. Othram's a DNA lab in Texas. Uh, so a remain was sent there. They did their DNA work and then the genealogy work. So we have a likely person, and what those genealogists do, and certainly there's people in the audience that can provide better explanation of what they do. But in short, they work the different DNA databases and follow the family tree to the most likely person. So right now it's huge because we have this person that we feel like is a likely person. So then what we have to do is get our boots back on the sidewalk and try to find that person's family member to get a DNA swab to confirm the identity. In this case, uh, this person has no living family members. His brother died of an overdose, and his mother died of an overdose. So we were lucky that we found out that the mother died in Marion County. We contacted the Marion County Coroner's Office, and they had a bloodstain card that we commonly keep just for these type of reasons. They had a bloodstain card from the mother, so we delivered that bloodstain card to Othram Laboratories, and I'm waiting any minute right now. I mean, every time the phone rings, I'm waiting for them to confirm that identification. So FGG, IGG, however you want to phrase it, is huge to this investigation.
There are a number of questions that are kind of all related to whether or not the police investigation has been reopened or if there will be any attempt to do that, particularly since there's speculation about Goodyear's involvement.
There has been new information come forward since the documentary. You know, my goal in doing that documentary was two-part. One, I wanted to bring attention to the case because that brings people in my door to provide family reference samples, but it also brings attention to the identification and the criminal investigations. I really believe that the documentary served that purpose. So, you know, I think because of the documentary, you may see some movement in law enforcement with this case. I hope that happens. And, you know, it's a complicated case. And the people involved are complicated people. So, you know, I do think that we'll see some progress and some movement from law enforcement in this case, um, certainly in assisting me in this case.
Eric has a comment that made me cry a little bit. He says, "Thanks for everything, Jeff. My family and I will never forget you."
You know, I'm assuming that's Eric Pranger that made that comment. And Eric and his family have become so special to me. They have supported me in this investigation from the start. Um, you know, they're fantastic people. Uh, Certainly have other family members out there just like them that are, you know, that are grieving, um, and that are great people too. But you know, I've got to say again, thank you, Eric, for making that first phone call. And thank you, you know, to your brother or to Shannon and to Matthew, and your family that has really just been there for me from the start. So kudos, buddy.
Um, John and a couple of other folks are wondering if there are plans to do any additional excavation on the land to see if other remains could be found.
So, you know, I think we're having conversations about that. To revisit there, you know, there certainly is some indication that there may be additional remains there. We've had teams of cadaver dogs on the property that have, you know, kind of directed us to certain areas of that property. Uh, we're going to make every effort that we can make to recover as many remains as we can because those remains represent people. And I'm not going to allow people to sit out in the woods.
There are a couple of questions related to the I-70 strangler. Tom asks, what were the links to the I-70 killer? Was it DNA evidence or was it MO? And Andrea notes that it wasn't in the documentary, but there's always been speculation that Herb was the I-70 strangler, and wondered if you had thoughts on that.
So, to answer the first part of that, I think, it's MO, kind of connection right there. I believe some of the people that were missing from Ohio were gay men, type of thing. We do know that Herb Baumeister frequently traveled between Indianapolis and Ohio, maybe from Indianapolis through Illinois, where some of these bodies were found. And, we're committed to supporting and assisting law enforcement in other states. But our primary focus, or my primary focus is, the remains that were found in my county. But again, committed to supporting law enforcement or coroner's offices from these other areas.
Tracy pointed out that there are 200 plus bones in a human body, and therefore with 10,000 bones, is there a possibility that there are far more bodies than we know about? I assume that many of those are fragments and that it's not actually 10,000 whole bones. But is there an estimate that you guys have made based on what bones you have, how many individuals those might be?
Dr. Latham, go ahead and answer that.
No, there was a minimum number of individuals that was provided in the 90s, and all of those duplicated elements were sent off for DNA testing originally back then. And so the number we have is probably much greater than that original estimate, because again, most of what we have is not complete. Most of what we have is fragmented. So we don't have a number. It's considered an open population, which is what also makes it much more challenging and why we're very protective of doing any unnecessary testing, because any one fragment might be all we have of an individual and our only chance at identification. So as Coroner Jellison mentioned, we're trying to be very careful to only test those bones that we think are going to produce a DNA profile. And if for some reason we don't think it's in the condition to do so, we're going to wait till technology catches up with it, because we don't want to lose that chance at an identification.
Kay says, Mr. Jellison, you are a true hero for taking on this massive situation. Please know that you are greatly appreciated for following up on this and ensuring that these victims will never be forgotten.
Thank you. The hero thing, I don't know about. In this investigation, I am successful because of people like Dr. Latham and the people at the Indiana State Police DNA lab and Othram Laboratories, and just everybody that's behind the scene. Yeah, I jumped into this, and shortly after I jumped into it, I said, "What the hell did I get myself into?" And I get to be the face to this investigation. But it's the people that are behind the scenes that are really, really the workhorses and the talent to this investigation. So, but thank you for that comment. I appreciate it very much so.
So Lynn asks, how many different DNA profiles have been found in the remains so far?
So, Dr. Latham, why don't you answer that? Because you've probably got the most up-to-date answer to that.
Yeah, so as Coroner Jellison mentioned, we've been sending about 20 to 25 samples to the state police lab quarterly. Generating DNA from skeletal remains is tough. So it's going to be a long and slow process. And right now we have 8 unique profiles But we have, multiple remains that have been matched to the same individual, and that's part of that process as well, is we're wanting to reassociate those individuals to be able to send them back to their families. But in terms of just unique DNA profiles, we have a total of 8 right now, 5 that we know are identifications, and 3 that we're still trying to identify, 1 that we're close to, as Coroner Jellison mentioned.
Tom asks about the skull that Baumeister's son found. Has it been identified as a person, or has it even been located? I thought I had heard that those were actually not recovered.
Yeah, to my knowledge, that skull was not recovered. It was gone before police got there. And I mean, Dr. Latham, please correct me if I'm wrong. We don't have any skulls, intact skulls, in the remains. So, unfortunately, we don't know. We don't know what happened to those skulls. Were they crushed like the other remains? Were the skulls taken to a different place? Unfortunately, I can't give you that answer.
Mark asked how many families have submitted DNA for people who have not been identified by your work to date.
We're probably nearing 35, 40 families that have submitted family reference samples, DNA swabs at this point. I'm still receiving phone calls. The interesting part of that is, so 30 years have gone by since this incident has happened. And, parents have passed away. Parents of missing people have passed away. Brothers, sisters, cousins, those kind of things have, moved or live in all parts of this country. We've sent DNA kits to Alaska, to Louisiana, to the East Coast, states on the East Coast. So, and those contacts continue, weekly with our office. So, we either will send them a DNA kit, or we'll rely on the assistance of local law enforcement coroner's offices, or even the FBI has offered their assistance in obtaining DNA samples. So, that number increases, often.
We're right at 6:30, so unless you want to keep going, maybe I'll just ask one more question. Amanda asks, with the remains that have been found, is there a way to determine the length of time that they were out there? Were there any remains there for many years, or was it just only in that span during the 1990s?
Dr. Latham.
So I am relatively new to this investigation as well, and in terms of I didn't do the original analysis, and I have not gone back and done any type of reanalysis here. Right now, what my role is trying to screen to pick which remains are going to be the best candidates for DNA profiling. But in terms of doing an analysis to try to estimate, time since death from when they were recovered, I don't know the answer to that, and I haven't gone back and relooked at any of that.
So we do know that, the remains that we've identified kind of match the timeline of those people, that went missing. So, if I understand the question correctly, could these remains have been from many years ago prior to being recovered? And there's no indication one way or the other of that at this point.
When did he move to Westfield? Because he lived in Indy before that, right?
Yeah, I don't know what year Herb Baumeister bought that property.
Well, thank you very much. This has been really moving and also very interesting and informative. Let's see here. we do still have quite a few questions, so I wonder if maybe I could send these to you, and if you have a moment to take a look, we could then like post answers later.
I'd be happy to answer any questions, that you have.
Okay.
Uh, an hour, this investigation is so huge that there's, I appreciate every question that's been answered, or excuse me, that's been asked. I've attempted to answer as many of them as can, but with an investigation of this magnitude and this size, there's really no way that we could get through the case in an hour. So, feel free to reach out to me via my email or reach out to Sarah with some of the questions, and I'll do my very best to get you some answers. And this case was covered up for so long that it's now time to be transparent with the case. So I take that approach and try to answer every question. I try to take every phone call, every email that comes in, because you do have an interest. And who knows what I might learn too from your question.
Thank you. That's very refreshing to hear. I really appreciate your time today and your empathy and your diligence.
Thank you.